In the autumn of 1923, on the flat wheat country outside Drumheller, Alberta, a 43-year-old farmhand named Gideon Rask did something the town of Penwick spent the next year calling foolish. He paid his last $80 for a quarter section of land. Everyone agreed was finished. Alkaline soil, a collapsed barn, and a well that had gone dry 2 summers running. The bank had taken the previous owner. The county had written it off. And Gideon Rask, who had buried his wife 4 years before and hadn't spoken more than necessary since, rode out there on a borrowed horse and staked it as his own. What Penwick didn't know, what it couldn't have known, because towns only watch the surface of things, was that a young woman named Laurel Fenn would arrive on the eastbound coach 3 weeks later with a split lip and a carpetbag holding everything she owned, and that Gideon, who had no reason to trust anyone and every reason to keep his head down, would be the only person in Penwick who looked at her without deciding first what she was. This is their story, a story about what people throw away and what refuses to stay thrown. Gideon signed the deed in the land title office on a Tuesday, standing across the counter from a clerk named Aldus, who looked at the paperwork the way a man looks at something he doesn't want to touch. "Rask," the clerk said, "you understand this property has liens outstanding it. Paid off. Bank cleared it this morning." The clerk checked the ledger, found the entry, and still didn't look satisfied. No surface water. Soil test came back poor. Previous owner tried 3 seasons. "I know what he tried, just making sure you have the full picture." Gideon pulled the signed copy across the counter, folded it once, and slipped it into his coat. "I've got it." He rode out that afternoon through the last of the harvest light, the prairie lying flat and pale around him in every direction, the badlands cutting away to the south in their strange orange crumble. The land he'd bought sat on the edge of that transition, too far north to be dramatic, too south to be good wheat country. It was the kind of place that existed between things, which was, Gideon thought, appropriate enough. The barn was worse than the listing had suggested. 2 walls stood solid, the other 2 leaned in opposite directions as if they'd argued and stopped speaking. The house was small. Single story, 3 rooms, with a window on the south side that someone had covered in oilcloth instead of glass. He pulled the oilcloth down and stood in the crossbreeze for a moment, looking out at the flat land going gold in the low sun. He didn't know if it would work. He thought probably not. But he'd been standing still for 4 years, and stillness had not improved anything. He drove the first fence post into the ground as the last light left the sky. The hammer rang against it in the cold air, steady and singular, carrying across the flat with nothing to stop it. When the post held, he moved to the next one. He worked until he couldn't see, then lit a lantern and worked a little longer. Inside later, he set his wife's photograph on the windowsill where the oilcloth had been. He didn't speak to it. He never had. He just wanted it where light would find it in the morning. The wind came up in the night and found every gap in the walls. Gideon lay on his bedroll and listened to it worry the loose boards, testing them. He stared at the ceiling and thought about the well. 30 feet down and dry. Something had shifted in the water table, or the well had been dug wrong from the beginning. Either way, he was hauling water from the creek 2 miles east until he figured out another answer. He closed his eyes. Sleep came the way it always did now, not peacefully, but eventually. 3 weeks after Gideon's arrival in Penwick, the eastbound coach from Calgary came in an hour late with a broken wheel brace and 4 passengers who climbed down stiff and irritable into the October cold. Laurel Fenn was the last one off. She was 28 years old, dark-haired, wearing a gray wool coat that was good quality, but had been pressed into too many seasons of service. She carried a carpetbag in each hand and set them down on the boardwalk, without putting them down the way you put things down when you intend to pick them up again. She put them down like someone who has arrived. The split on her lower lip was 3 days old, still colored. She didn't hide it and she didn't explain it. She asked the station agent where she might find a room. He told her Mrs. Calder kept the boarding house on First Street and charged fare. He looked at her lip once and then kept his eyes on the schedule board. Mrs. Calder gave her the room at the end of the hall, the one with the best window and the coldest draught. Laurel took it without complaint. She set her bags beside the bed, sat on the edge of the mattress, and looked at her hands for a while. She had been a schoolteacher in Lethbridge. She had been, until 6 weeks ago, engaged to a man named Roland Pickett, who sat on the town council and had a large handshake and a wide, practiced smile. When she ended the engagement, after the second time, he made her understand what happened to things he owned that stopped cooperating. Roland Pickett had gone to the school board with a story. The story was detailed and specific and entirely false. The school board had listened carefully and let her go before the end of term. She had no intention of explaining any of this to Penwick. What had happened in Lethbridge was behind her. What was in front of her was finding work before her money ran 2 weeks short of nothing. In the morning, she went to the general store and asked if they needed help. They didn't. She went to the post office, the dressmaker, and the hotel kitchen. By noon, she had 3 polite refusals and a sense of the town's temperature. Penwick was not unfriendly, exactly. It was simply careful. A woman who arrived alone with a healing bruise on her face was a story. The town hadn't yet decided how to read. She was walking back up the main street, deciding between the grain office and the schoolhouse, when she turned the corner and walked into a man carrying 2 water drums on a wooden yoke across his shoulders. The drums swung. Laurel stepped back. The man stopped, set the whole apparatus down with the deliberate care of someone managing heavy things, and looked at her. He was tall, lean in the way that comes from work rather than build, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that needed the better part of a week's shaving. His coat was patched at both elbows. His eyes were the kind of gray that doesn't change with the light. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't see you." "Nor I you," she said. He looked at her once, not at the lip, or if he did, she didn't catch it, and nodded, and picked up his yoke and kept walking. She watched him go and then turned back toward the grain office. She found work at the grain office after all, as a ledger clerk. The owner, a Mr. Aldus Dewar, was a meticulous man who distrusted his own arithmetic and needed someone to check his columns twice a week. The pay was modest. It would do. She learned Gideon Rask's name from Mrs. Calder's boarding house table, where news moved freely and without malice. "The man with the Harker land," Mrs. Calder said one evening, passing the bread. "Bought it in September. Nobody thought he would, and I'm not sure anyone thinks he'll last the winter." "He seemed capable," Laurel said. "Oh, capable enough. But that land." Mrs. Calder shook her head in the fond way of someone enjoying a good unfortunate story. "No water. No neighbours worth mentioning. He's hauling creek water in drums twice a week in this cold." Laurel ate her soup and thought about that. Hauling water across 2 miles of prairie in October. It was the kind of work that told you something about a person. She met him properly 2 weeks later. She had walked out past the edge of town on a Sunday afternoon, needing air and distance after a week of close indoor work, and the road she chose happened to run east. Toward the creek, as it turned out, and toward the man crouched at the bank checking a joint in a length of pipe he was trying to run along the road's ditch line. He heard her coming, which she had not expected, and looked up. "Miss Fenn," he said. "Mr. Rask, you know who I am. Small town." He turned back to the pipe joint. "You working at Dewar's?" "I am." She stopped beside the road and looked at what he was doing. "Are you trying to pipe from the creek? Trying to see if the grade runs right?" He pressed the joint, found it wanting, and took it apart again. "It doesn't, particularly, but there might be a workaround." She looked at the slope of the land, the barely perceptible tilt of it, the way the ditch ran. "The grade drops toward your property after the second bend." He looked up again. This time he held it a moment longer. "You've been out that way?" "I've looked at the map, the survey map in the land office. I was checking a title reference for Mr. Dewar." She paused. The elevation drops nearly 6 feet over the last quarter mile. If you ran it along the south ditch with a secondary drop point at the bend, you'd get natural flow. He set the pipe section down and studied her. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's probably not helpful." "It's the most helpful thing anyone's said to me in 2 months," he said. And then, without fanfare, he pulled out a worn notebook and a pencil and handed them to her. "Show me." She sat down on the bank because there was nowhere else to sit and drew it out. He didn't ask her about the lip. Not that day, not the next time he came to Dewar's for supplies. Not the Sunday 2 weeks later when she walked the pipeline route with him and held the surveyor's level while he drove stakes. He didn't ask, and she noticed the not asking the way you notice a weight being lifted. Gradually, then completely. She told him anyway, eventually. It was a cold, clear afternoon, and they were sitting on the south step of the house he was slowly repairing, drinking coffee out of tin cups, and she found herself tired of the particular effort of not mentioning it. "In Lethbridge," she said. "There was a man. I was going to marry him." Gideon wrapped both hands around his cup and waited. He was the kind of man who was very well liked, and she said. He knew how to talk to people. He knew what they wanted to hear. She looked out at the land. The pipeline trench ran across it in a straight line, not yet filled. "When I ended it, he told the school board I'd been conducting myself improperly with a student. He said it with a lot of confidence and very precise details, which I think is how you get people to believe things that aren't true." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. "They believed him," she said. "Most of them. Or they decided they couldn't afford not to. Which I suppose amounts to the same thing. Did anyone speak for you? One teacher?" She said she didn't believe it. "They let her go at the end of term, too." Laurel turned her cup in her hands. "I'm telling you because you haven't asked, and because it seemed unfair to keep accepting your—" She stopped, unsure how to finish. "Patience," he said. "I was going to say consideration." He nodded once. "I had a wife," he said. "Elsa. She died of typhoid in 1919, September." He looked at the trench for a while. People said things after. About why I'd been out of town when she took sick. About why I came back too late. Some of them were just sad and looking for somewhere to put it. Some of them meant it. He set his cup down. "You learn who's who." She looked at him. "He'll have more to say," Gideon said. "People like that generally do. You should know that, and be ready for it." She had known it. She simply hadn't expected anyone else to say it plainly. "I'm ready for it," she said. He picked up his cup again. They drank their coffee and watched the cold light move across the prairie, and didn't say anything else for a while, which was its own kind of answer. Winter came hard that year, as it does in the Badlands country, arriving not with warning but with decision. One morning it was autumn, the next the world was white and sealed. Gideon worked through it. He finished the pipeline before the ground froze solid, barely, and it ran the way Laurel had sketched it, water finding the path she'd mapped for it, arriving at the stock tank near the barn in a thin but reliable flow. He stood beside that tank the first morning it worked and put his hand in the water and felt it cold and moving against his palm. He fixed the barn walls before the deep cold set in. He banked the house with sod against the wind. He acquired 2 draft horses, on credit, from a farmer south of town who was selling off, and moved them into the repaired stalls, where they stood patient and warm and made the place sound different at night. Breathing, shifting, present. He came to Dewar's once a week for supplies, and sometimes stopped at the boarding house to drop off a cut of meat or a sack of turnips that he said were surplus. Mrs. Calder accepted these without comment. Laurel said nothing about them either, which seemed to be the right response. The town watched all of this and made its usual calculations. It was Margaret Holst, the banker's wife, who said it first at the church social in January. Said it loud enough to reach 4 tables and a punch bowl. "I don't know what that woman thinks she's building out here," she said, meaning Laurel, whom she had never spoken to. "She came from somewhere and there was a reason for it. You don't just leave a good position." "She was let go," someone said. "That's what I mean," said Margaret Holst. The comment reached Laurel through Mrs. Calder's niece, who told her with the barely contained energy of someone delivering important news. Laurel thanked her and went back to her ledger work and did not respond, because she had learned that responding gave small fires oxygen. She didn't tell Gideon. He heard it anyway, Penwick being what it was, and came to the grain office the next day while Dewar was at the mill. "You hear what's being said?" "I heard." He stood at the counter. He wasn't a man who moved his hands when he talked. They stayed still at his sides, which gave everything he said a kind of settled weight. "There's going to be more of it. Probably from Lethbridge." She set her pen down. "He wrote to someone here?" "I don't know that. I'm saying it's the kind of thing a man like that does, if he finds out where you are." She looked at the ledger in front of her, the neat columns, the checked figures. She had rebuilt something small and workable here. She didn't want to be afraid of losing it again. "What would you do?" she said. "If it came." "Same thing I'm doing now," he said. "Stay put and let the truth be what it is." He picked up the supply list he'd come in with. "What do you need?" "The pipe's holding, but there's a joint near the bend that's going to need replacing in spring." She handed him the order slip. He looked it over, nodded, and left. She went back to her columns. Her hands were entirely steady, which surprised her. The letter arrived in March. It was addressed to Aldus Dewar, on stationery from a law office in Calgary, and it made a series of careful, measured claims about a former employee named Laurel Fenn, whose departure from her previous position had involved. And here the language became precise and administrative in a way that was clearly designed to be believed. A pattern of dishonest conduct. Dewar showed it to her on a Monday morning. Setting it on the counter between them and watching her read, she read it twice. The second time she noticed how carefully the language had been constructed. Nothing that could be specifically refuted. Nothing provable in either direction. Just the implication, dressed in legal weight. She put the letter down. "Well," Dewar said. "It's not true," she said. "None of it is. I can tell you what happened in Lethbridge if you want the account. I can give you the name of the teacher who was let go after she defended me. I can give you the dates and the school board minutes, which are public record." Dewar looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who ran his office on the principle that numbers didn't lie and that most people did, but rarely about arithmetic. He had watched Laurel's work for 4 months. "I'll keep the letter," he said, "and I'll want to see those board minutes." "I'll write for them this afternoon," she said. She didn't go to Gideon. She had decided, sometime in the night after reading the letter twice more by lamplight, that she would not bring her trouble to his door before she had done what she could herself. He had his own ground to hold. But he came to her 2 days later in the grain office after hours. He knocked, which she hadn't expected. "Word travels," he said when she opened the door. "Word always travels." He came inside and stood in the lamplight. He had mud on his boots from the spring melt starting at the field edges. He didn't look agitated. He rarely did. But there was something in the set of his jaw that she had come to recognize as what passed for anger in a man who had decided long ago not to waste it on the air. "Who sent it?" he said. "The law office in Calgary." She hesitated. "Roland Pickett has a cousin who practices there." "Right." He put his hat on the counter. "I want to go to Lethbridge." She blinked. "I'm sorry. There are people there who know what happened. The teacher who defended you, maybe others. Things like this don't stay clean. Someone usually saw something, or knows something that wasn't used, because there was no reason to use it yet." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not saying you can't do it yourself. I'm saying I have the time, and the road's better now that the ice is breaking, and 2 people asking questions get more answers than 1. She studied him. Why? It was the first time she'd seen him at a loss for words, even briefly. He picked up his hat, turned it once in his hands. "Because what happened to you was wrong," he said. "And because I know what it is to be stood up about by people who should have known better and didn't." He set the hat back down. "And because you figured out my pipeline grade when you had no reason to." She almost laughed. She felt it rise in her chest and held it, because she was afraid if she let it out it would turn into something else. "All right," she said. "When can you leave?" They went to Lethbridge at the end of March, when the roads would carry a wagon without swallowing it. The teacher's name was Constance Mayer. She lived in a boarding house on the east side of the city, having found another position at a smaller school after the loss of her job. She opened her door, saw Laurel, and took a breath that was almost visible. "I wasn't sure I'd hear from you," she said. "I wasn't sure I'd come," Laurel said. Constance let them in and made tea and sat at her kitchen table, with the careful posture of someone who had been bracing for something, and was now releasing it slowly. She talked for an hour. She named names. She produced, from a wooden box under her bed, a collection of notes, some in her own hand, some copied, that documented what she had seen and heard in the weeks before the school board hearing. She had not produced them at the hearing because she had not been asked to speak. She had raised her hand. She had been looked past. Gideon sat in the corner of the kitchen and said almost nothing the entire time. He listened. He asked 2 questions, both of which were about dates. He wrote things in his notebook in his plain, deliberate hand. They spoke to 3 other people before they left the city. A former school board secretary, who had since moved to a different position, and was no longer afraid of Roland Pickett's social reach, a livery owner, who had witnessed something he had not, at the time, understood the significance of, and a woman named Beatrice who had worked in the building next to the council offices, and had heard a conversation she had told herself was none of her business. All of them spoke, some reluctantly, none of them refused. On the drive back, the prairie opened around them in the late afternoon light, still flat and brown and cold, but with the first suggestion of green at the field edges, the kind of color you had to look hard to see. "He counted on everyone staying quiet," Laurel said. "They usually do." Gideon kept his eyes on the road. "It's a reasonable bet. But not everyone stays quiet forever." She thought about Constance keeping that box under her bed, waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for someone to ask. "What do we do with it?" she said. "We give it to Dewar, and we send a copy to the school board in Lethbridge." He was quiet a moment. "And we send one to the law office in Calgary, so they understand what the other side of the case looks like." "That might not be enough." "It might not," he said. "But it'll be something. And it'll be true, which is more than what he sent." She looked out at the land going past, the coulees cutting south, the sky enormous above the Badlands rim. She had come here because she needed somewhere to go. She had not expected to find anything worth staying for. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her briefly. "Thank you," she said. He turned back to the road. "Don't thank me yet. Wait and see how it lands." But she could see, even in profile, that he was not entirely unmoved. It landed slowly, the way true things do. Dewar read the full account and the supporting documents with his usual, methodical care, page by page, in silence, while Laurel sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, he set the papers down and was quiet for a moment. "I'll keep you on," he said. "I should have said that before you went. You waited for evidence," she said. "That's not the worst thing." "No," he said, "but it wasn't the best either." The copy sent to Calgary was received, acknowledged, and not responded to, but the letter to Roland Pickett's cousin's office stopped being followed by further correspondence. The silence that came after it was, Laurel had learned, its own kind of answer. The school board in Lethbridge wrote back in May. The reply was formal, correct, and acknowledged that the original proceedings had been conducted with incomplete information. It did not offer Laurel her position back. That position had been filled. It did not apologize exactly, but it put the acknowledgement in writing, and writing had a way of becoming a permanent part of the record, which was what mattered. She read the letter at the grain office counter and then walked outside into the spring afternoon and stood in the street for a little while, feeling the sun on her face. Penwick had watched all of it, as Penwick always watched things. It had watched Gideon come in with documents and go out again and return from Lethbridge with a woman who sat up straight in the wagon seat. It had watched Dewar keep Laurel on and had recalibrated accordingly. It had watched Margaret Holst continue to have opinions and had, for once, decided not to follow them. The town did not apologize either. Towns rarely do, but it corrected course in the small particular ways. The dropped eye contact that became a nod, the nod that became a word, the word that became, eventually, something that felt almost like the beginning of ordinary. Summer came in with the smell of cut grass and warm earth, and Gideon's land began to look like something he had imagined, and not yet been able to prove. The pipeline ran clean through the whole season. He dug a second well. This one in a location Laurel had found on a geological survey map from the Provincial Land Office, a survey done in 1911 that showed a subsurface clay boundary indicating a likely water-bearing layer 12 feet below his current dry hole. The driller hit it at 11. The water came up cold and strong and smelling of deep stone. Gideon knelt beside the new wellhead and ran his fingers through the flow. He didn't say anything. He had learned that there were moments that didn't need talking over. Laurel was standing behind him with the geological survey rolled under one arm. She had driven out on a Sunday to see it happen. "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. He built a fence along the east quarter that summer and planted the south field in winter wheat and repaired the house properly. Glass in all the windows, the south wall reframed and insulated. He did not rush any of it. He had come to understand, over the last 8 months, that this piece of land did not respond to urgency. It responded to patience and to showing up. He came to town each week and usually found a reason to stop at the grain office, which Dewar had stopped finding worth commenting on. Laurel walked out to the farm on some Sundays, which Mrs. Calder had also stopped commenting on. Having decided that two people, who were both clearly going to keep doing something, were not worth the commentary. One evening in late August, they were sitting on the south step again, the step that had become, without either of them naming it as such, their particular place for talking about things that mattered. The wheat stood in the south field, 3 weeks from harvest, and the light on it was the long, amber light that only comes for about 40 minutes in late summer evenings on the prairie, and makes everything look like it was always going to be fine. "I've been thinking," Gideon said, which was not an unusual statement, but the way he said it was different. Laurel waited. "This place needs more than one person," he said. "Not for the work. I can do the work." He looked at the field. "I mean, it would be better to have someone to share it with." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not saying this well." "You're saying it fine," she said. He looked at her then. He had a particular quality of attention, full and direct, with nothing withheld, that she had come to think of as one of the most uncommon things about him. "I know what you came from," he said, "and I know you don't need anyone to manage your affairs. I'm not offering to manage them." He stopped, started again. "I'm asking if you'd want to build this with me, this particular thing, on this particular ground." She looked at the wheat, at the new wellhead gleaming in the low light, at the barn with its repaired walls and the horses moving in the corral, and the long straight line of the pipeline trench she had sketched on a creek bank in October. "I've been looking at that geological survey from 1911, she said. He blinked. "There's another water-bearing layer," she said, "on the north quarter, if you're thinking of expanding the wheat and adding any livestock." She turned to look at him. "So yes, I'd want to build this." He said nothing for a moment. A smile moved across his face, slow and real, the kind that had clearly been out of practice. "I'll have to speak to Dewar about his ledger," he said. "I expect he'll manage." "I expect he will," she said. The light held on the wheat for another few minutes, the way light does when it knows it's needed, and then eased off into the long prairie dusk, and the two of them sat with it and let it go. Penwick made its peace with them the way towns make peace. Not all at once, not with any particular announcement, but in the accumulated weight of ordinary days. By the following spring, Gideon Rask's land had a name people used without irony. Rask Farm. Two words that sat together the way things sit when they've decided to stay. Laurel taught letters and arithmetic to 4 children from nearby farms on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in the front room of the farmhouse, with the south window full of light. It was not the position she had lost. It was something she had built instead, which meant it fit differently, shaped around her own outline rather than someone else's. There were people in Penwick who had said things they no longer said. There were people who had waited before deciding. There were people who had decided wrong and then decided again. None of them made speeches about it. They simply showed up at the harvest and helped with the threshing and ate at the table that Gideon had built from timber hauled in from the mill. And the past sat where pasts sit, behind everything but no longer in the way. Roland Pickett remained in Lethbridge, where he continued to be well regarded by people who had not yet needed to look closely. That was his business. Some things resolve and some things simply recede. And Laurel had learned to know the difference and to let the second kind be what it was. The winter wheat came in well that first harvest. Gideon stood at the edge of the field and watched the thresher work through it, his hands easy at his sides. Laurel stood beside him with a cup of coffee she'd made on the stove inside and brought out because the morning was cold. He took it without looking away from the field. "It's enough," he said. "It's a start," she said. He looked at her then, sideways, with that slow, quiet smile she'd only seen a few times but had come to count on. "All right," he said. "A start." The thresher ran on into the morning. The sky above the Badlands was the clean, hard blue of a prairie October, the kind of sky that doesn't make promises but keeps the ones it makes. The wheat came off the field in good order, and the land, which everyone had agreed was finished, went right on proving them wrong.